Hello, good evening. Nice full house tonight. Someone a fan of full houses there? I am really thrilled to welcome Paul Krugman to campus tonight. I'm a great, as many of you are, a great devotee of his writing and his logic. Even on those days when he skewered the administration that I was a part of, I appreciated the depth of his argumentation. And we're also really happy to have Austin Goolsbee here, our very own, in conversation with him. Mr. Krugman's new book, Arguing with Zombies, Economics, Politics, and the Fight for a Better Future, is for sale, and he'll be signing copies after the program concludes. In the interest of time, he'll not be personalizing those signatures, but please buy the book. It's a great collection of his work. Tomorrow, former Senator Rick Santorum and Bill Kristol will be discussing the future of the Republican Party, and that will be moderated by IOP Pritzker Fellow Margaret Hoover, the host of Firing Line. So it should be a really interesting, provocative discussion. I hope you'll attend that. On March 9th, we'll host a conversation on the long-term relationship between the United States and Iran. And on March 10th, Peter Baker of the New York Times will moderate a panel discussion on the long-term impact of President Trump's impeachment, what it means for American institutions for 2020 and beyond. As always, information about other programming can be found on our website, politics.uchicago.edu. After the discussion, we will open the floor to take questions from the audience. Please line up behind the microphone in the center aisle. Everyone is welcome to the mic. We'll prioritize the first three questions for students, and I ask that we alternate men and women on these in asking these questions. Please put your phones on silent. And now to formally introduce our speaker is Hopi Melton. Hopi is a second year from St. Louis, Missouri, studying public policy and sociology. During her time at the Institute of Politics, she has been an events ambassador, a fellows ambassador, and she is an organizer of UChai Votes, which is an important effort campus-wide, and I'm sure she'll want me to remind you that the Illinois primary is coming up on March 17th, so those of you who are registered or who plan to register and participate, please pay attention to the activities of UChai Votes. You can find it at uchivotes.com, and please join me in welcoming Hopi to the podium.
Thank you so much, David, for that introduction. I'm honored to welcome our guests here today because I know that they have helped me and many others to understand confusing economic principles and the hectic current political and social climate. In this changing time for our nation and our world, especially approaching the 2020 election, it can feel at times that issues like healthcare, technology's role in our lives, job security, are all distant, hard to grapple with economic questions. Tonight, we are here to hear about how those issues and the misconceptions around them can be better understood in more approachable terms. Mr. Paul Krugman is a distinguished professor of economics at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Since 1999, he has been an op-ed columnist for the New York Times, and in 2008, won the Nobel Memorial Prize for Economic Sciences for his work on international trade theory. His new book, Arguing with Zombies, Economics, Politics, and the Fight for a Better Future, breaks down the recent history and coming future of some of the major economic issues of the day in very accessible terms using lots of his old and new columns. Alongside his most recent book, Mr. Krugman has written and edited widely in academic journals, readable economic texts, and textbooks, including my younger sister's macroeconomics textbook, so I wanted to give her personal thanks for that. In seriousness and in short, Mr. Krugman is widely considered one of the most influential and interesting economists at work in the world today. Our moderator this evening, Professor Austin Goolsbee, is the Robert P. Gwynne Professor of Economics here at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. He is also the former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors to President Barack Obama and served as the chief economist and staff director for President Obama's Economic Recovery Advisory Board. His academic work spans various issues, including tax policy and the role of technology in the economy. Maybe his most important role, though, is writing my microeconomics textbook that I've used widely in my public policy classes here at the university. So I'm also sending him my thanks for that. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Paul Krugman and Professor Austin Goolsbee to the stage.
Hi. Okay, we got a great turnout. Thank you, everyone, for coming. You left out of the bio that when I was pretty much your guys' age, some of you, and I started as a PhD student at MIT, there was a young professor who hired me as a research assistant, and his name was Professor Paul Krugman. And you may not remember that.
I do that.
You got that's where I got my start. So in this book, Paul, you begin with you go through a bunch of topics, subject matters, and
Right.
let's walk through them. But you start with almost like philosophy of what's your approach, and you list 4 things. Your approach to punditry. Keep it easy. That is, don't focus on subtle academic distinctions.
Right.
Speak in English. And then don't be afraid to challenge people's motives, and don't be afraid to call out dishonesty. 2 of your 4 are confrontational, let's say.
Yeah.
Is that when you sit down to write a column, who's your intended audience? What do you feel like is your purpose of writing?
Okay. So I'm writing for a pretty sophisticated audience, but not sophisticated about economics necessarily. So people who follow public affairs, New York Times readers, basically, people who read stuff that gets syndicated from the Times, who tend on average to be a lot better informed about events, but not to know economics particularly, and who need to be to kind of understand. I guess need to understand that we're not living in the world we'd like to be living in, where we were having genteel, serious arguments about stuff. That most of the important economic debates that take place, and other things too, but most of the important policy debates that are taking place are debates in which one side is not arguing in good faith. That's just the fact of the world we live in. And so to be fair to my readers, I have to not pretend otherwise. And mostly, am I managing to persuade people? Maybe a little bit, but a lot of it is also giving people the language, the concepts to understand what they're in, and maybe they themselves can make arguments more effectively.
Interesting. And in one of the columns, you make the distinction between the conservative professional economists and the professional conservative economists.
Right.
And one being more dishonest than the other.
That's right.
And what motivates, where does it come from? Where does the is it about money in your view? Is it that we've become partisanized over everything so we don't care, or what happens?
Well, we have become partisanized over everything, but a lot of it does have to do with money. Upton Sinclair, it is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. And you cannot understand the state of policy discourse in America without understanding how many of the people you see on cable TV are essentially paid advocates, are essentially flacks. Now, you and I know economics as a profession has a fair number of conservatives compared with other social sciences. There are a fair number of conservative economists, and many of them are good economists and good, honest people. They are not the ones you're seeing on TV. They are not the people who are being hired by the Trump administration. They're not actually wanted by the party currently governing America, because the very fact that they are serious, good economists means that they might actually have an attack of conscience. And might actually show some principles. So what they're going for instead are the people who are absolutely reliable, because being a paid advocate for certain policies is what they do. It's what they may do for a living.
Is there do you see any way to change that, or is this what it will be forever?
Oh, who knows? I mean, obviously, I have to hope that we can change it, and that we can eventually get back to a situation where I'd love to live in a world where there were where we were actually having honest debates about stuff, and it's possible that after a series of decisive elections, we'll get back to a point where both parties realize that we have to actually seriously address issues, and we may have differences in values, and we may have legitimate, defensible differences of opinion. But that's not the world we live in right now.
The first subject matter that you start in the book goes back to the election of 2004, and is about Social Security.
Right.
And it starts with, look, George Bush runs. He wins a narrow victory in 2004. He comes in essentially arguing, I have a mandate to privatize Social Security.
Yes.
And Social Security is in a crisis. We got to do something. And the curse of the very serious people that everybody scratches. Oh, yes, it's a very serious problem that we need to deal with. Why does it fail? In a sense, George Bush did win the election, in a way does have a political mandate, has a lot of support in Congress, is unable to bring that across the line. Let's think about that moment, and then let's ask, if Donald Trump were to win in 2020, are there things that would prevent him from doing the same, either to Social Security or to health care, or are times different?
Okay. So let me try and hold for and not forget to answer the Trump question.
I'll bring it back.
But so part of it was that in the 2004 election was what the Brits call a khaki election. It was a military, national security. Donald Trump was the defender of our freedom, with a bit of sort of social values as well. As I like to say, George Bush ran as the nation's defender against gay married terrorists, and people who voted for him were not thinking, oh, and that means we should privatize Social Security. And then there was there were a fair number of Democratic-leaning pundits and so on who did favor transforming Social Security, but then it turned out that they were just out of touch with the reality of American life. So if you're a highly educated person with a good job, then you have a substantial 401k, maybe you even have a traditional pension, you have savings. You don't realize that most people in America depend on Social Security for most of their income, and that about a third of Americans depend on Social Security for essentially all of their income in retirement. You don't understand how critical that program is to ordinary Americans' lives. And so it turned out that Social Security privatization was, if anything, even more unpopular in deep red states than it was in blue states, because there were a lot more people, a lot more poor people there. And so that was just a misjudgment. But still, it also depended a lot on, I hope it depended at least a little bit on policy wonks like me saying this is a really bad idea, but it depended a lot on determination. And one of my favorite lines of modern political history was when Nancy Pelosi was asked, when are you going to produce your alternative plan for Social Security? And she said, never, will never do for you. And so it was a really steadfast opposition of a few crucial leaders. And I start with that part because that picks up where my last column's book left off, which was a long time ago, but also because that was the first policy fight where my side actually won.
So fast forward you do feel that it does feel like there's some of the same dynamic going on with big tax cut, so the deficit got a lot bigger. So then the argument in the budget, in the Trump budget, is we got to cut Medicare, we got to cut Social Security because the deficit is threatening to be out of control. If Trump were to win and has the House and the Senate, do you in your heart
if he has
of
the
hearts,
House and the Senate, both. No,
Yeah, let's say he
remember
has
the
the House
Affordable
and
Care
Senate.
Act was almost one vote. John McCain stopped the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, and 30 million people would have lost health insurance.
So it sounds
if-
like you're nervous.
No, if
You
Democrats hold the House, then we have some protection. But if it's full Republican control of government, not only would the ACA be gone, not Obamacare be gone, but we'd be seeing major cuts to Medicare and Medicaid and probably Social Security. That goal hasn't changed.
But would that not run into the same problem that the privatization of Social Security ran into, which is ordinary people would say, whoa, 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 hold on a second.
Well,
or do you
but-
think it's not as...
But we're even more polarized. I mean, 2005, which is when the Social Security privatization, it was already a pretty polarized country, but not where we are now. Now you have an absolute lockstep Republican Party. No one would dare, no matter how much their constituents hated it, no one would dare vote against Trump on it.
And it has seemed that President Trump has been creative at executive orders, management by executive order, in a way that's more muscular even than all previous presidents want to engage in executive orders, but tariffs, when that's not naturally a presidential thing. Do you think even if they don't, if he were to win the election but they kept the House, do you think that he could undo it?
You can do a lot of
just that?
sabotage. You can't utterly reform, you can't utterly transform the programs. I mean, some of the places where Trump has done a lot are areas where it turns out, unfortunately, we had created a policy framework that gives the president a lot of discretion. So, trade policy is my old home territory. That's where I started, and we have a system that is designed to protect trade policy from special interest lobbying in Congress. But in order to do that, it still has to have some flexibility, some ability to respond to events. And the way that our trade law deals with that is by giving a lot of discretionary power to the president, who is supposed to be sensible and act in the national interest. And nobody ever contemplated that you would have a president who would be, turn that on its head. So the president, it makes sense. You have a provision. The president is allowed to slap on tariffs to protect industries in the name of national security. Nobody ever imagined that we would have a president who would say that importing aluminum from Canada threatens our national security. But there it goes, and so and it turns out that legally there's no recourse. Now that's not true every place, and it turns out that Obamacare has been surprisingly robust to sabotage. The people who put it together built it well, it's hard to sabotage Social Security. You can do some sabotage of Medicaid, and that has been happening. As usual, the places where the most damage can be done are it's the most vulnerable people in society who are at the bleeding edge of this stuff.
And as you think about the trade, it's your original home of academic economics.
Right.
How destructive is aggressive trade war agenda? Do you see any credit to the argument that only by being aggressive can you get other countries to change their behavior? Does it not matter because trade isn't that big as a U.S. economy? What do you think?
Yes.
Yes to all.
Oh, yes to all.
Okay.
First of all, trade is not as important as people. I do talk in arguing with zombies about this, that there is this tendency to make international trade, to assign it more importance than it deserves. It's not that it's trivial, but it sounds important. It's global. Actually, at one point in my life, my parents gave me a sweatshirt that said "Global Schmobile" on it, and I asked why, and they said, "Well, you're always going off to some conference, and when we ask you what it's about, you say Global Schmobile," and so global, sounds important, and it's not unimportant, but in a way, the policy importance of an area depends on partly on how big it is, but also on how screwed up it is. And so, since we start from trade policy that's not that screwed up, we're pretty close to free trade, and it's not all that distorted. Even slapping on a bunch of tariffs still leaves it not the worst thing compared with healthcare. It turns out we spend about the same amount of money on healthcare that we spend on imports. But healthcare is totally distorted, totally screwed up. So healthcare policy is much more important than trade policy. The Trump trade war has actually done more damage than I expected to, because I didn't factor in how much it would create uncertainty and cause businesses to put expansion plans on hold. And that's turned out to be an unexpected downside. Now, the thing about whether you should be more aggressive, there are real problems. China has, in some important ways, not been a good global citizen. And given the scale of the Chinese economy and the fact that they're not that poor anymore, that they should be stepping up much more than they do. And there is a case for getting tough with China, but it's a case for a coalition of all of the countries that do play by the rules to get together and put pressure on the Chinese to stop ripping off technology and that sort of thing. It's hard to think of a less effective way to do this than to launch a unilateral trade war with China at the same time that you're declaring that imports from Canada are a national security threat, right? This is you have zero credibility here and no allies. And what we've actually gotten, after all of that, we've got a promise from the Chinese to buy more soybeans, a promise which it appears they're not actually even honoring. So the whole thing has been amazing. I would not have predicted, even I didn't expect that the trade war would be as unsuccessful as it's turned out to be.
And if you not flip the script, but let's think about Brexit then. And in the book, there's discussion about the euro and it feels like trade is a bigger deal to a smaller country in Europe. Does the move to Brexit, which is in the same style, threaten the UK more, or over the long run?
Oh, it's a bigger deal because the UK is more dependent on trade, and because Brexit is the thing about Brexit is not the tariffs. It's not clear actually whether they might in the end get a free trade deal with Europe. But what Europe has is, one of those things which. When keeping it simple, so things I don't want to get into because they're in the columns, but there's a big difference between a free trade area and a customs union. A free trade area is no tariffs. A customs union is basically no border. You pay the same tariff if you unload a cargo in Rotterdam that you pay if you unload it in Hamburg. And so, and which means that goods can flow completely frictionlessly across Europe. And what Britain has done is it has thrown up a border, which means that there will be customs checks and delays, and it just means that everything gets a little bit more difficult. And that's going to impose some costs. It's going to, the estimates, it's tremendous amount of hand-waving involved, but I'd say maybe make Britain in the long run 2 or 3% poorer than it would otherwise be, which is bad but not catastrophic. And we know what a free trade area without a customs union looks like. There's this country north of us that poses a national security threat, apparently. But anyway, Canada doesn't have a customs union with the U.S., and it's a small economy next to a much bigger economy. So it's basically in the same position that Britain post-Brexit is. And it does hurt. Canada is a little bit less productive than we are, in part because of that. But it's not a disaster area.
Now, then there's a big chunk in the book about the financial crisis. And a lot of the columns still feel current. Most things written during and before the financial crisis they feel very dated, but a lot of these do not feel very dated.
Right.
As you look out in the landscape now, do you fear future financial crises? Or do you feel better? Are we in some sense in a better position than we were before?
No, we're basically in a worse position than we were before. Now I don't see, or I didn't see. I'm starting to now. Things are moving a little bit, but if you'd asked me 2 weeks ago, I didn't see anything that looked remotely as big as the shock that hit us in 2008. And we had a monstrous housing bubble, which was the most obvious thing I've ever seen, except nobody would believe it. And it turns out also that we had an extremely vulnerable financial system, so that when the housing bubble burst, it brought down large parts of the financial system with it. And I don't see anything like that on the horizon. I may be missing it, but there's nothing comparable in size. There's bunches of smaller stuff, student debt, corporate debt, various things out there, but none of them look on that scale. So I'm not sure I see an enormous shock coming, although maybe microeconomics, as we say, may be the shock. But whatever the shock is, and there will be one, the problem is that we don't have any shock absorbers anymore. That we came into the last financial crisis, interest rates were 5–6%. There was plenty of room for the Fed, well, we thought, it turned out not enough, but there was room for the Fed to cut interest rates. There was room for a policy response. Now, interest rates are 1.5% in the US. They're negative in most of the rest of the advanced world. So the technocrats who we usually count on to protect us are out of ammunition. And there are other things we could do. So we could have a smart, well-calibrated fiscal response. And if that's what you think, I have 2 words for you, Steve Mnuchin. Think about who would be in charge of that response. So I think we're actually, I don't see a comparable size shock coming, but I think we're extremely poorly positioned to deal with whatever shock does come our way. And if the latest stuff I'm reading, I'm now reading epidemiology Twitter, and I'm getting extremely scared.
Now, in the book, and it's totally to the point of fiscal policy, you were and still are quite publicly of the view that the tragedy of the financial crisis and the recession that followed is that the stimulus was not bigger. Right. And in some of the pieces say the tragedy was that we didn't put the focus on job creation. Is this political system able to handle the kind of stimulus that you're describing, in the sense that at the time it was the biggest stimulus ever in American history? It came down to 1 vote, and the parts that we now look back and say were the most effective, like giving money to the states to spend, that was the politically most unpopular part of the stimulus, and all the marginal voters in the Senate and House were like, we want less money to the states and more just pure tax cuts. Is it conceivable that we could actually do it?
All right, I think a rehash of that history is probably not that productive, though I will note that people were, in the Obama administration, were saying we cannot just use reconciliation to waive the filibuster. We got to have 60 votes in the Senate. And then in 2017, Republicans pushed through a $2 trillion tax cut using reconciliation. They didn't have any of those inhibitions. So I still think that it could have been done, and I have some of the columns in the book, and if those of you who remember, I was tearing my hair out saying this stimulus is the right thing, it's going to help, but it's going to fall short, and then Republicans are going to say it failed because it's too small. But in a way, the bigger thing was that all across the Western world, we turned to fiscal austerity while unemployment was still at nosebleed high levels, and that was disastrous. Now, can we do it now? Well, again, the problem, let's say if we have ask me in January, if we have a president I don't know, President Sanders, President Bloomberg, you name it. I have no idea what's going to happen. With a Democratic Senate majority, probably they would be able to do it. Under current management, I mean, the reports are that just the obvious thing, which is to let's spend some money right now to deal with the coronavirus, that the Trump administration initially said, okay, but we have to pay for that by cutting heating aid for low-income families. This is not the attitude of people who are going to respond to a crisis with effective stimulus.
So let's say a Democrat wins and they call you and they say, what do I do? You know, and let's say the coronavirus either doesn't show up or is not, or its effects are past. What do you think of wealth tax? Would you favor repealing the Trump tax cuts?
Okay.
On the tax side, what do you think? And then let's think about the spending side.
I think we can repeal most of the Trump tax cuts because it's mostly corporate tax cuts. The public opinion thinks that corporations pay too little in taxes, so I think that's actually would be fine. Wealth tax, I mean, there is a legitimate debate about how much money those would raise, and I tend to think I'm more on the Elizabeth Warren side of thinking that they would work because I think that, well, that's going to get into the kinds of technical discussions that are not best done on the op-ed page. But okay, it's a legitimate thing, but also I'm just not too worried about budget deficits. I think that they're just not a clear and present danger. What we really need is we want a really aggressive program of investing in the future, both in terms of climate protection and just in general, infrastructure and all that. So if I was in a position, I'd say let's do a Green New Deal. Let's have a big Green New Deal. And people say, well, nobody quite knows what that means. And I say, that's right, and that's what's so great about it. Because it can be a bunch of stuff, a whole bunch of good stuff, which we can sell, which will have provide clear benefits to lots of people, and will along the way also help save the planet and rebuild our creaky infrastructure and just do good stuff.
Okay, now that's what I was about to ask you was, as we've gone through the primary, it seems like if you were asking what's the Democrats' #1 priority, if I told you you have over 10 years in the trillions, would you spend it on health care? Would you spend it on climate? Would you spend it on infrastructure or some other collection, whether it's student aid and student debt or some other thing? Where do you put priorities?
All right, I'm not sure I got it sorted out quite that well. Let me tell you what I think you want to finish what Obamacare sort of got us 60% of the way to. You want to make sure that we get close to universal coverage, but it doesn't have to be purist. The intellectual case for single payer is really pretty good. The political possibility is almost zero, even if Bernie Sanders becomes president. So go for incremental stuff that will get us the rest of the way. On social spending, where the U.S. really stands out as being incredibly stingy compared with every other advanced country is family aid, especially things that help children. So I would be saying universal child care, fully funding child nutrition, child health care, so which is a form of investment in the future, and
Put
also
us back to international.
And universal child care would not cost very much money, but it would be transformative for a lot of people's lives, and so that's a real priority. Infrastructure is obvious, and the question is, how do we pay for it? And the answer is, we don't. We borrow. The financial markets are practically begging the U.S. government to borrow money, and this is an investment in the future. So spend on infrastructure, and of course, climate. And on climate, I'm a fanatical anti-purist. Some of our colleagues think that carbon tax is the only thing, because that's what the Econ 101 textbook says. But it's also kind of unpopular, and it's also, in fact, it's not the only thing. So a very eclectic mix of climate, everything from infrastructure investment to green technology to financial incentives, and then if you can, if there's enough sweeteners in there that you can actually sell people on a carbon tax, fine, let's do that too.
As you look at Bernie Sanders, you've written that in a sense he's claiming the mantle of socialism and the negatives that come along with it, but he's not really a socialist.
Yeah, it's the most. I mean, it's going to be a peculiar thing if he's the nominee. We're going to have a period of months during which people like me are going to be saying, "Don't worry, he's not actually a socialist," and he's going to be saying, "Yes, I am."
No, yes, I am.
I know a lot of people like that. Actually, I know a lot of people who like to talk about how radical they are, and then it turns out that their actual ideas are pretty sensible, and that's fine. Except it's probably not a very good way to run for president.
Now, in Senator Sanders' approach, it's changing a little bit maybe this week, but he's been, I guess I would call it kind of aggressively non-numerical, non-policy. So Elizabeth Warren, in a way, says, I'm for a Medicare for all, and here is what I meant.
Yeah.
And then they asked Senator Sanders, well, how do you pay for yours? And he says, I don't care, leave me alone. And in 2016, he had an economist who said that the single-payer Medicare for all would raise the growth rate to 6%, and it would pay for itself and pay off the national debt. And the Christy Romer, Alan Kruger, a series of people said, whoa, don't do this. And you wrote publicly at that time something to the effect of, whoa, do you really want to alienate a bunch of the technocrat wing of the Democratic Party? Are you nervous about that? Is the Democratic Party moving to one in which they say the proper battle position is one where we don't have to defend numbers because the Republicans aren't defending numbers, so let's just get into the mud?
I think to a large extent. I mean, the simple, in a way it's easy because Bernie has these enormously ambitious plans which are going to die in Congress within 48 hours of his inauguration. So you don't need to really worry about whether the numbers add up because none of it's going to happen. But the progressive attitude will remain, and that's a good thing. So my view is that any Democrat, if he or she wins, will basically have the same program. It will actually, in fact, be a significant but not gigantic expansion of the safety net, financed by higher taxes on the wealthy and some borrowing. And if it's somebody like Sanders, he'll come in with vastly more ambitious schemes, but reality will set in. And if it's somebody like Bloomberg, his instincts might be to be more like a traditional Republican, but the party won't let him do that. So they'll force him to be fairly progressive too. So I don't think it actually makes a whole lot of difference. Now, it is kind of upsetting. I mean, that I don't think it helps to have Sanders with these clearly unsustainable numbers out there. But among other things, the technocrat winning of the Democratic Party, to the extent there is one, everybody with any sense is not going to quibble. When it comes to the general election, the only question is, do you have somebody who wants to save democracy, or do you want to have somebody who wants to destroy it?
And do you? So I would never put you on the spot of who you're liking or anything like that. But how do you suggest to others as they look at this? If your view is on policy, they're all going to end up the same.
No,
how do you figure out who to be for?
Well, I think it does make somebody said this, that in policy plays an interesting role in the Democratic Party, policy proposals, because the political realities mean that what's actually going to come out is very different. They act as some signaling about the candidate's personality understanding of the issues. Is this person running someone who really thinks hard about stuff, and is this someone who knows who turns to the right people for advice? And look, it's really, if that's your question, who clearly thinks deeply about the policy issues and really gets genuinely serious experts to help craft policies, then Elizabeth Warren is in a class by herself within the field. But that, I don't think she has much chance at the nomination. What do I know at this point? I think she made some political misjudgments, and maybe, sexism is an issue. And beyond that, yeah, I mean, by the way, if there's a Sanders presidency, I expect that for at least the first year or two, people like you and me
I was going to ask.
will be shut out.
I was
Will not be welcome because
does it seem like that's the end of the Krugmans of the world if we move to a no numbers philosophy?
We won't be welcome in the White House until stuff starts to go wrong, and then we will be again. and I'm okay with that.
Now, do you think that let's say Sanders or Trump, either one is elected, do you think that more of your writing is going to end up being about the Supreme Court and the courts as time goes forward? Does the legal system start becoming the place where policy is running into constraint? It
may be. I mean, I have to say, if any Democrat is elected, then we may start to find ourselves in a kind of 1930s situation where the Supreme Court is blocking progressive initiatives, and that's going to be that's one scenario in which you may find yourself writing about. If Trump is reelected, I think it's going to be a very different. I mean, I spent a lot of time, for peculiar reasons. When I was still at Princeton, a good friend, constitutional lawyer who happens to focus on, Kim Lane Shepley, focus a lot on European issues and speaks Magyar. So she was actually tracking the collapse of democracy in Hungary. And so I was paying a lot of attention to that. She was actually blogging on my blog because the mainstream media were not really covering it, and she was trying to get the word out. And so if Trump is reelected, I think we're looking at a Hungarian scenario in the United States, a political party that will try to turn us, will still be a democracy on paper, but they'll be trying to turn us into effectively a one-party authoritarian regime. So that's kind of a little bit bigger than just Supreme Court.
Okay. Last question, and then we're going to go to the audience. What do you think about the economic impact of coronavirus?
Okay. So I've been waiting for, the epidemiology, because as we sit here, I believe the president is explaining it all to the nation because he's an instant expert. And I actually fixed, the Times had a map of the spread of the coronavirus, and I fixed it on my Twitter feed today by adding some lines with a Sharpie to show that America was protected. But it's looking scary. It's looking like a big deal. It's looking like it's highly transmissible and quite often fatal. So this is a big deal, and it's a big deal economically because we have not just an integrated global economy, but we've got a supply chain global economy where every product, where was this thing made? And the answer is lots of places. China was the last stop, but it was made all over the place. And so you start to break those supply chains because people are afraid of infection, and it's a really big adverse shock to the economy, and we have no shock absorbers. So the coronavirus looks like it could, 2 weeks ago, if you asked me, was there any real chance that it would cause a global recession, I would have said no. If you ask me now, am I prepared to predict that it will? No, I'm not. But though that does not look like a trivial probability anymore. This is looking like a really big thing.
Ooh. Okay, we got the microphone right here. Say just who you are, if you're a student, what year you are, and what foodstuffs you have stored in your basement or under your mattress in case it gets here.
Well, thank you so much for being here. My name is Izzy. I'm a second-year Harris Master's in Public Policy student. So just thinking about my education here, thinking about talking with two economists, I guess what are the limits of thinking about public policy around economics? That I'm in a bunch of classes where we use microeconomics right now and are getting good ideas and using econometrics, but where do you think it falls flat from including community voices, including people who don't make it to these stages, or in other parts of public policy making? Thank you.
Oh, wow. I mean, I think there's a couple. One is, can you think about everything in terms of economics? And the answer is very much not. In fact, economics has this, the sort of core of the field is this beautiful model of perfectly rational people and perfectly functioning markets, which is basically science fiction. Useful science fiction because it sometimes helps you think things through, but you have to know that it's not really, it's not the truth. And the question then is always, how do you, where do you make the deviations? And many things involve motivations that have nothing to do with the kinds of things that economists have any expertise in. But I believe in the usefulness of social science in general. Sometimes economics, sometimes other things. And economists are notorious for intellectual imperialism, for thinking that they're smarter than other social sciences and that don't need to read or listen to what the other guys say. By the way, physical scientists do the same thing to economists. So, and the truth is that sociology may seem a lot less, or political science may seem a lot less rigorous than economics, but that's because they're harder subjects. Economics, at least, it's mostly about greed, and so we know how to model that. So I believe in turning to everything. I actually sit at the Stone Center for the Study of Socioeconomic Inequality at the City University of New York, which is a genuinely interdisciplinary group. We've got sociologists, we've got political scientists, and we all talk to each other. And when I'm writing something about politics, I actually go down the hall to Leslie McCall, who studies the political science of inequality, and ask Leslie, am I saying something stupid here? And sometimes she says yes. So so that's hard study is always valuable, and economics has a lot of important answers, but not all the answers, and just listen to people.
You make sure you have the good textbook. That's it.
Yeah. Yes.
I have your textbook. Hi, good evening. My name's Kat Burnham. I'm a second-year MPP at the Harris School. Thank you for your remarks. I wasn't planning on asking a question, but then I saw the line of students, and I thought, why aren't there more women up here? So I first want to thank Mr. Axelrod for encouraging alternating between men and women and others. So my question to you, what are you doing to encourage women, non-binary folks, and others to get more involved in this field? Are you mentoring? Are you also encouraging other people to come up to the microphone? How can we work on this issue? Thank you.
Okay, I'm not doing enough is the answer, is the main answer. I do, and I'm also not mostly in the stage where I can do as much mentoring as I'd like, because I'm. Your best mentors for economic study tend to be people who are younger and more involved in where the field is. I'm 67 years old and almost, and probably not at that stage. But I certainly try as much as I can. But we've been having a bit of a scandal in the economics profession, as we've learned, or it has become now common knowledge that there's a really rampant sexism in the field, and the most horrifying thing to me is that I was oblivious to it all those years. I didn't even notice. And that's an object lesson. And so you do what you can and try to make sure that, that proper credit is given, that I offer advice, but there's probably other things I should be doing. But at least I try to be self-aware now.
You can see it.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Rodrigo Estrada, and I'm a student of economics here at UChicago, full disclosure. At a time when our public discourse has become so polarized and divisive, it seems like positive economic analysis can offer a much needed and serious lens on big problems facing our society. However, does your tendency to use expertise as a political platform hurt rather than help the conversation by alienating scholars, not just here at UChicago, but vast swaths of the public who already have a growing distaste of expertise and public or professional elites?
Okay. I don't think I'm alienating anybody who wasn't determined to be alienated anyway. And one of my main points is that we've gotten to a situation where facts, where even acknowledging the importance of facts is a partisan position. I mean, but back in the Bush years when Stephen Colbert said facts have a well-known liberal bias, that was kind of a joke. Now it's not a joke at all. It's very much, that's just the way things are. So, and you need to be forceful. I mean, otherwise it just, if you write a carefully worded, neutral language piece pointing out the facts, you don't move anything. It just disappears into the background noise. You gotta grab people's attention, and you do it. I don't make fun of people's personal appearance. I don't do insults. In fact, it's interesting. I mean, I keep on running into people who think that I'm calling them zombies. It's the zombie ideas, not zombie people. There are some of those out there, but I don't call them out on it. John Maynard Keynes, who I consider one of the two greatest economists in history, the other being Adam Smith, there was one essay in which he said, I don't have the full quote, but he said, words ought to be a little wild because they are an assault of thought upon the unthinking. You just need, you need to be colorful. You need to, it's one of the things, actually one of the things that's really good about writing, the discipline of writing newspaper columns that I think could be useful for a lot of our academic colleagues is understanding that you don't have a captive audience. Nobody has to read what you write. You have to grab them. And so aside from the content, just you have to think about the selling. Every column has to start with a hook to pull people in. Every column has to end with a stinger so that they remember what you told them. And name me a judicious, moderate-sounding person who is having a useful impact on public discourse right now. I can't think of one.
Okay.
Hi there, my name is Doa. I'm a third year in the college. I'm an econ and art history major. I'm kind of going to circle off this topic and more going to ask you a question about healthcare. You kind of touched upon this during when you were talking about single-payer systems, but I was just curious about how you think about, well, not getting into technicals here like you said, but do you think a blue candidate has a better chance advocating for Medicare for all or Medicare for America? When you look at it technically, one of them eliminates more deadweight loss in a sense, but on the other hand, the other one is a lot more acceptable to the public.
Yeah, so I'm going to give a probably longer answer than I should, but every advanced country besides us has universal health care. They do it in different ways. I actually teach a course on this stuff, and there are three kinds of system. There's actual socialized medicine where the government provides the health care directly, Britain's NHS or our own Veterans Health Administration. There's single payer, which is Canada has, and which is totally un-American and antithetical to our values, except that every American over 65 has it, because it's called Medicare. And then there's some kind of decentralized private system where a combination of regulations and subsidies gets everybody under the wing. And then the Netherlands and Switzerland have systems like that. They all work. All of those systems work. If you ask which is most cost effective, it's probably socialized medicine. The British NHS is incredibly cheap relative to our system, and in terms of actual outcomes, does just as well as ours does. Single payer is somewhere in between. The complicated, regulated, subsidized, decentralized system is more complicated, and that incurs some costs. But they all work. My concern is that people are conservative, not in a left-right sense, but that getting people to accept big changes is hard. And so you don't ask them to accept big changes unless there's a really compelling reason to. 160 million Americans have private health insurance. If you're going to be pushing for Medicare for all, you're saying, and banning private insurance, you're saying to those 160 million people, we're going to take away what you have and replace it with something completely different. Trust us, it'll be better. And it probably will be better, but you're asking people to accept a lot on faith. And given all of the other urgent things we need to be doing, that's not where I would be spending my political capital. Now, it's very likely the Democrats will have a candidate who is saying that that's what he's going to do, and I'll be writing a lot of columns saying, look, you really should trust him, it will be better. But it's not, I don't think it's a good political strategy.
Hi, I'm Leon Zhou, and I'm currently a first year. Currently, a lot of politics seems to be about repealing what the opposite party has done, whether it's healthcare or tax cuts. So is there a way to make it more constructive in terms of policy? Like, is there a perfect tax number that both sides are sort of okay with? And is there a way to sort of make shock absorbers and the Green New Deal that the opposite party won't try to repeal a few years down the line? Thank you.
Okay, no. No, I mean, really, look, the idea that there is some policy that can, let's take climate change. The idea that there's some policy on climate change that can command broad political acceptance. There are people who think that. Imagine that a carbon tax that's rebated to the public, so it's not bigger government, is somehow going. They're dreaming. That's not the world we live in. We have. Again, if we can't even agree on basic facts, the idea that you can craft bipartisan proposals, you're living 35, 40 years in the past. Someone's done a count. 60% of Republicans in Congress outright deny that climate change is happening. Just about all of the rest deny that there's anything we can do about it. So if you think that you're going to be able to come up with some bipartisan climate change proposal, it's just not going to happen. You have to recognize that this is the world we're living in. It's going to be bitterly partisan. Now, I think that the Democratic agenda is a lot more than just undoing what the Republicans have done. I think there's a lot of new stuff. I mean, Obamacare was new. I mean, that was after healthcare reform crashed and burned in 1993, there was a long period when it was off the table, and we came back and got it done. Even though it was imperfect, even though it's incomplete, 20 million people got health insurance who didn't have it before. Lives were saved. People I know had their lives saved by Obamacare. So we're not just talking about tit for tat, and we're not talking about little kids. We're talking about one side that is actually trying to make people's lives better, and one side that is doing the opposite.
Good evening. I'm Allison Mobley, a first year in the medical school here, also majored in economics in undergrad. I'm wondering if you can speak to the role of the healthcare provider in advocating for healthcare reform, maybe how you've seen that done well in the past, or what advice you'd have going forward.
Okay. Well, I think it is helpful to have healthcare providers, to have doctors and nurses speaking out for better healthcare. There is a slightly awkward fact, which is that we do kind of have a medical industrial complex. And there will be, so first of all, the drug companies, the medical equipment manufacturers make out like bandits under the US system, and they will be opposed to anything that really tries to cut into that. And some physicians are really very, very highly paid compared with their counterparts in other countries. And so they would be, not nurses, by the way. So when people say, oh, what about, you want to cut healthcare costs, what about all of those people who depend on healthcare for a living? Well, most of the people who depend on healthcare for a living are not, in fact, highly paid doctors. They're, if anything, underpaid nurses. So that's okay, but there will be losers. But there are also, I think, there are still a fair number of idealists in the healthcare profession. And we need those voices. I mean, I would, when the next healthcare bill comes up, I hope we'll have a parade of eminent medical professionals standing up and testifying on behalf of it.
Hi there. I'd like to know your thoughts about the fact that unemployment is at record lows, but also wages are very low. Some people blame on AI,
right,
automation. If that's the case, in the future, it will be much worse in the last 10, 20 years. Thank you.
Okay. The whole robots are taking our jobs. Let me just focus on that. It's a very popular position in Silicon Valley, among some politicians, among a lot of intellectuals. And you can see it sounds serious, it sounds futuristic, it has everything going for it except the evidence. If robots were really massively displacing jobs, if robots were replacing workers, then you'd expect to see that the remaining workers were very productive. And in fact, productivity growth is at historic lows, not highs. And so you just don't see that in the data. And and this is where I think elite bias, as in high socioeconomic status bias, really is an issue. People like me, people like probably most of the people in this room, we see revolutionary change in information technology, and which is true. Although it's a little bit less revolutionary. I mean, the New York Times tech people, for the first time ever, said, "Don't bother buying the new iPhone. It's really not significantly better than the last one." But still, there has been dramatic improvement in some areas. But we didn't. There have been lots of revolutionary technologies. We used to have hundreds of thousands of longshoremen loading cargoes on and off ships. They were replaced by giant cranes that are operated by a few dozen people. People like me didn't know any of those longshoremen who lost their jobs. So that was revolution. That was robots in a way taking away jobs. But this happened in the 70s and 80s, and it just wasn't people we knew. And that was arguably a bigger transformation than anything that's happening from AI right now. Coal mining. You know, what happened to the coal miners? It actually wasn't. It wasn't environmental restrictions. That came on very, very late in the game, and it wasn't even declining demand for coal, because that only happened quite late in the game. What happened was that instead of sending guys to dig out coal from underground, we started just blowing the tops off mountains, and that's again technological change that displaced what used to be hundreds of thousands of jobs. So the idea that we're living in an era of especially rapid revolutionary technological change is just not the facts. It's just not what's happening. And maybe it'll happen sometime in the future. Maybe there will come a point. You know, ask me again in 20 years. Maybe the robots will come for all our jobs, or alternatively, maybe the robots will just decide to kill us all. I'm a Terminator fan. But it's not what's happening now.
Hi, my name is Sanam. I'm a student from the Monk School at University of Toronto. You mentioned that there should be a better focus on universal childcare plan, particularly within the health and education spheres, just because of the major impact that it poses. However, around the world, we're seeing that the major cuts that are being made in policies, like be it Canada or India, have been in these social sectors. And my question is, in your opinion, what are the specifics of the best case scenario of this plan look like for it to be actually implemented?
Oh gosh, I'm not an expert in childcare policies, but I talk to people who are, but I haven't. But what I know is the numbers, and Canada spends about 3 times as much as a share of GDP on family-oriented policies as the United States does. And Canada has, by the way, achieved a dramatic reduction in poverty in the last few years through government programs, largely programs aimed at family aid. Now, the specifics, again, Warren has a pretty detailed child care plan, which looks good, was put together by the right people. But the main thing is, again, I don't think it's very complicated. I think it's just a question of allocating enough resources. And you can do it. I mean, little... New York City, Bill de Blasio manages to be abrasive and has managed to make himself kind of personally unpopular, but has actually done a pretty good job of managing New York City. And one thing he did was universal pre-K. That's just a city on its own, and the amount of difference that makes to the lives of hundreds of thousands of families in New York City is huge, and that's with just the limited resources of a single city. So what you could do in the United States, if we were prepared to devote an extra 1% of GDP to family policies, you'd be amazed at how much the lives of ordinary people would get better.
He copied Chicago, but okay. Next question.
I didn't know that, actually.
Yeah. That was Ram push
okay.
for that. They're
Talking about
facing,
people with annoying personalities, yeah. Which, by the way, is, in the end, that doesn't matter. What matters is what they get done.
Get it done, yeah.
So true. Thank you for being here. I'm Andrew Wise. I'm a second-year student at the Harris School of Public Policy. I remember your columns from 2009 and 10 critiquing the Obama stimulus for being too small and the subsequent turn to fiscal austerity.
Yeah.
Which, as I recall, was endorsed by President Obama himself.
Yeah.
In which I think I recall these. The exact words aren't important, but. I guess my question, though, is you talked about how you think any Democrat would functionally end up pursuing a similar center-left agenda that wouldn't go as far as, say, what Bernie Sanders is proposing, and I largely agree, but my question, though, is more about political strategy. What do you think the prospects are for avoiding some of the mistakes of the Obama era, given that a lot of the same people are still in charge, and we hear Joe Biden constantly insist that Republicans are going to have an epiphany? Yeah. I don't know what planet he's living on, and who knows what Michael Bloomberg thinks?
Well, yeah. I mean, two things. Well, there are some new players on the board, but also I think people have learned a lot. I mean, if you, so yeah, I was very critical of Obama for not pushing hard for a bigger stimulus and for rhetorically endorsing austerity, although it's not clear, I think, that he could have fought it once Republicans took the House, but still, he should have tried. He should have been making a better case. But people do learn and change. I mean, there was a big essay saying basically let's stop worrying about deficits and start investing in the future by that well-known left-wing firebrand Larry Summers, along with Jason Furman from the Obama administration. So that it may be some of the same people, but they themselves have changed their tune quite a lot. And so I wouldn't worry too much that we're going to have a repeat. There was a moment there, a long moment in the early 2010s when what I call, I stole the phrase, but I mean, very serious people, capital V, capital S, capital P, were all pushing for fiscal restraint as the most important thing to do. I think that the Democratic Party, most of it, has learned from that. Not Pete Buttigieg, but he's still talking like that. But the rest have learned. So I wouldn't worry too much. And I've actually had this, by the way. So I've been doing various book events, and somebody says, how do you reconcile what the people around Bernie Sanders are saying about deficits with the deficit hawkery of Larry Summers? I say, have you read anything Larry's written in the last 5 years? That's not what he's saying now.
Well, thank you for your input, and completely unrelated. I used to work in the physical sciences myself, and you're right about what some of us say.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Victoria. I'm a first year at Booth. I have another health question. Do you think that moving towards a single-payer nationalized system will be sufficient to solve a lot of our problems, given some of the differences we have compared to other developed countries? For example, the time it takes to obtain a medical degree in this country, the cost of it, and also access issues to affordable produce and healthy food, and the standard American diet, which is obviously related to chronic health conditions that are costly.
Oh, yeah. Say no healthcare system can solve things that are lifestyle issues. They can mitigate. So, so we have an epidemic of deaths of despair, and healthcare reform won't end despair, but it might mean that more people who might have died of an opioid overdose will get treatment soon enough to save them. We do have problems, yes. The whole healthcare provider pipeline is in the United States is kind of set up to make costs really high, and all of these things. But we don't have to solve it totally. We spend 18% of GDP on healthcare. Lots of other advanced countries spend 10%. We don't have to get down to that. If we can get down to 15%, that already is a lot of progress.
Well, I'm sad to say we have time for only one more question. They're sending me the signal on the timing, and I apologize that we have the line there, but
put some pressure on
make it good.
My name is Rohan. I'm a first year and a student at the college studying economics and psychology. I wanted to thank you both for giving your time to be here. And I wanted to ask further into your ideas about climate change and solving climate change. Now, you mentioned that a carbon tax would be ineffectual in the long term, and even now. I just wanted to know more where you think we should be spending more money, and not only spending more money, but how should we better enforce companies having more greener practices?
Oh, I don't think a carbon tax is ineffective. I think a carbon tax would help a lot. Putting prices on emissions is a proven successful policy in a lot of, with the, I'm old enough to remember acid rain, and we were very successful at reducing sulfur dioxide emissions by putting a price on it through the cap and trade system, which functionally acts like a tax. So, but the point is that it's not the whole story. And so a lot of it is investment in infrastructure and technology. Those are the things and to some extent, standards as well, because it's not always clear that people will do there are often cost-effective measures to reduce emissions that people don't do because they don't realize. And sometimes regulations can induce people to take decisions that end up being financially beneficial in a way that just putting a tax will not. So I'm just for a very broad front approach to this stuff. Everything we can think of should be tried at once. Carbon, what I am concerned about, the thing that I'm running into problems with colleagues, with people that are not purveyors of zombie ideas, is that too many of our colleagues are purists. They just think that emissions taxes are what the textbook says is the right answer, and therefore it's the only answer. And I just think it should just be part of the answer. But you know, anything we can get done. And of course, anyone who thinks that there's some way to sell Republicans on a carbon tax, again, is living in a fantasy world. So you have to take that into account when you're trying to come up with your policies as well.
Okay, we're going to have a book signing. Because we want to get as many people as we can, we're not going to have personalization. So we can sign the books, but we want to get as many as we can. But please join me in thanking Professor Krugman for taking the time to come out and join us.